maybe we can start with there has been the annual presser from Vladimir Putin. He does it every year, 4 hours long. This time around, I think both the journalism, media, as well as the public, experts, etc., were combined. And there are a few highlights from it. I have a few videos, very brief on social media to play. One of the statements that he made that I do not have, but perhaps you all could comment on, which has the Western mainstream media going a bit haywire, is his comments on Odessa, calling it a Russian city. There has been intimations from the West for so long that Russia is going to take Odessa at any moment. But some of the other highlights, Carl, I believe you shared this. When the New York Times and Xinhua, which is a media outlet in China, were vying for a spot to ask a question of Vladimir Putin, he had this to say.
Нью-Йорк Таймс. Дайте, пожалуйста. Нет, давайте мы сначала дадим Синьхуа, а потом Нью-Йорк Таймс. Да.
So, a bit of a dig at the New York Times. And then he had some comments on Gaza as well, which have been making the rounds. He called Gaza the largest cemetery for children in the world. And here's what he had to say in comparison to Ukraine, which many people have been making these comparisons given the scale of the destruction in Gaza.
Вернемся, я так понимаю, еще к ситуации, связанной с украинским кризисом. Но и вы, и все здесь присутствующие, и во всем мире видят, посмотрите на специальную военную операцию и то, что в Газе происходит. И почувствуйте разницу. Но ничего подобного в Украине нет. Значит, вы упомянули о гибели тысяч детей и женщин. Но генеральный секретарь Организации Объединенных Наций назвал сегодняшний сектор Газа самым большим кладбищем детей в мире. Но это вот такая оценка о многом говорит.
So, what struck me the most about what the statements that were highlighted from the presser, which was 4 hours long, mind you, was the confidence, the assertiveness, and of course the emphasis on sovereignty, on independence, and of course, really, I think, making an emphasis that Russia and really much of the world is moving away from the West, moving away from the US and from NATO and from its empire. But I want to kick it to you. Whoever wants to begin, maybe Ben, if you wanted to start.
Yeah, I think there are a few things to take away from the speech. First of all, this comes at a time, of course, when it's essentially been admitted in the Western press that Ukraine has lost this war. And there are reports, I'm a little skeptical, but there are reports that allegedly people in the US government are having kind of backroom deals going on in negotiations to try to potentially bring about an end to this war, because they recognize that the longer they wait, the more Ukraine is going to be defeated. I mean, Ukraine has already been defeated, but it's going to be an even worse situation. And that's why there's this discussion now about Odessa and other areas in Ukraine. And if another very important takeaway from Putin's presser is that he said repeatedly that the United States created this problem. He was asked about Russia's relations with the West and with Europe. And he said, Europe is going along with this problem that was created by the United States. And specifically, he said, we have been saying from the beginning, and even before this new phase of the war, that we wanted an agreement with Ukraine. He mentioned the Istanbul peace talks. And he said, until they come to a security agreement and refuse to join NATO, this war is going to continue. And of course, this is not just Putin saying this. I mean, there's so much evidence at this point, but I recently did a report looking at two new pieces of evidence from October and November, which was first the former chancellor of Germany, the former head of state. Of course, chancellors, people don't know, it's like the prime minister equivalent. Gerhard Schroeder from the Social Democratic Party, he said in an interview that he was involved in trying to negotiate peace between Russia and Ukraine in early 2022. He said that the Russians wanted peace. They had a series of agreements, and their conditions were very basic. Ukraine had to be geopolitically neutral. It could not join NATO. It had to provide autonomy for the eastern regions like the Donbass. It had to respect the rights of Russian speakers. All very basic things that were supposed to be implemented by Ukraine. Let's not forget, after in 2015, there were a series of negotiations in Belarus that led to the Minsk Accords. And Ukraine was supposed to implement all of those things and refused to, of course. Anyway, the point is that Gerhard Schroeder said, the former German chancellor, said in this interview that the United States controls everything in Ukraine and nothing gets done if Washington doesn't approve it. And then there were very similar remarks made by a top Ukrainian official in November, who is the head of the parliamentary faction of Zelensky's political party, Servant of the People, which, you know, is named after the TV show that Zelensky became famous for being the star of, where he plays a teacher who accidentally becomes the leader of the president of Ukraine. And the billionaire oligarch who funded that TV show and owns the TV channel also funded his political campaign and his party named after the TV show. Anyway, the point is, the parliamentary faction of that political party in Ukraine, he said in an interview with Ukraine's channel 1+1, the same thing, that Russia wanted to sign a peace agreement in March 2022, a few weeks into this new phase of the war. And it was the Western powers that told Ukraine, no, do not sign a peace agreement. He said that the most important thing for Russia was that Ukraine does not join NATO. That was, and in fact, according to this Ukrainian official, he said everything, all the other conditions were not as important. The most important condition that Russia put out was that Ukraine can never join NATO. And what happened, according to this interview, he said that Boris Johnson came to Ukraine and told them, do not sign a peace agreement, fight instead. And of course, I would add, Boris Johnson would never do something like that if he wasn't being told to by the United States, because, you know, the UK just goes along with whatever Washington tells it. So, I mean, if it's easy for the Western media to say that all of these things that Putin said in his presser constitute Russian propaganda, right? But what Putin said has been reaffirmed by the former chancellor of Germany, by a top Ukrainian official, and let's not forget, earlier this year, the former prime minister of Israel. Of course, the closest U.S. ally of all, Naftali Bennett, said the exact same thing in an interview. He said, after he left as prime minister and was replaced by Netanyahu, but he said in this interview that he was negotiating peace between Ukraine and Russia. And he said that the Western powers, specifically the U.S., but he also mentioned the UK and Germany, they did not want Ukraine to sign a peace agreement with Russia. And he said, the former Israeli prime minister, this war criminal, close U.S. ally, he said he thought it was a mistake for them to do that. And here we see the results of that today with how many Ukrainians dead, the country devastated, and this war continuing because they refuse to allow Ukraine, the Western controllers, the U.S., which is really who's in charge in Kiev, they refuse to allow the leadership to sign an agreement.
Carl, if you want to jump in.
I mean, Ben pretty much covered it all. This is the Ukraine war is a tragedy that doesn't need to happen. I mean, by now it's well known. It's a U.S. proxy war against Russia. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to Biden, he thought this was an opportunity to really stick it to Russia, but also to get the Europeans on U.S. side, kind of bind European onto the U.S. wagon, and also force the European take the U.S. stance, including the containment of China's. That U.S. really thought there was that would play opportunistically. They thought there was a golden opportunity to both stick it to Russia and stick it to China by, you know, corralling, and as a side effect is corralling the Europeans into the U.S. camp. So they can't think of you know, starting their own. And it for a while it almost looked like you worked brilliantly. But the problem that we know, I think in an article that you pointed out, Ben Norton, that was the problem is the United States have industrialized itself voluntarily. And it's done that because the capitalist class in the United States, in chasing the bottom lines, in trying to cut costs, chasing the lower labor cost in Asia, they hollow the U.S. manufacturing sector. Since 1970, the process started even before the opening of China. Of course, after the opening of China, all the U.S. industry packed up and left. And now we end up with a situation where U.S. economy on paper is still the world's largest economy nominally. But and Janet Yellen goes on to say, oh, U.S. can afford two-front war, in Ukraine and Gaza. But the reality is, the U.S. can. U.S. really can. I mean, U.S. can print money all it wants. But at the end of the day, that money is not going to buy artillery shells for Ukraine. And the United States, despite $1 trillion spent on the defense budget, cannot physically produce artillery shells for Ukraine. So it's a supply problem. And Europe is facing the same problem, by the way. So and with now, because all the major production is now in East Asia, in China. And this is why they're also panicking about China's rise. Now they want to so-called de-risking, and they also want to somehow shame China to side with Europe and United States in sanctioning Russia, which is they're out of their mind. They're openly said our strategy is to go after Russia and then go after China. So why would China help the West to destroy Russia so they can come after China next? I mean, I sometimes I don't know if it's they imbibe too much of their own propaganda, that they think everyone is stupid. But I think by this point everybody sees through their charade, and we are at the point where we're witnessing in an accelerated timeline the collapse of the U.S. imperial system. Especially the war in Gaza. I think that really exposed the hypocrisy of the West, and I don't think they expected, because Jake Sullivan before October, he went on air and said Middle East hasn't been this calm for a long time, and he was taking credit for it. He said because of the Biden administration, because of our efforts, so the Middle East hasn't been calm for this long time. So now they're being caught off guard. They have to divert their energy to support Israel, and we all know Ukraine or Taiwan, nobody comes even close to the golden child status of Israel in the U.S. politics. So there's not going to be much resources left for Ukraine. For Israel to continue its work in Gaza, they need continuous supply of U.S. ammunition, because let's face it, Israel is not a major industrial power. They play a compartmentalized role in the U.S. empire system. They do some research and development, but they don't have the industrial capacity to produce all the ammunitions they need to wage a prolonged war on the Palestinian people. And this is why U.S. Biden administration, assumed after October 7th, was on board to send tons of weapons to Israel. That means there's less resources to go around for Ukraine. And so by now, I don't know if people saw that image of Zelensky in Washington sitting with Lloyd Austin. I mean, I joke it's like Zelensky got called to the principal's office to explain his action, but that's exactly what it looks like. Now we have, I think the media is also preparing for the Western abandonment of the Ukraine, because you have that Times article that basically portray Zelensky as this delusional person who thinks that West will back him up no matter what. In a way, it's correct, but this is all West doing, as Ben correctly pointed out.
I wanted to, I mean, yes, there definitely is a crisis on many fronts, and I think there's a lot of desperation here. We're seeing more and more stories and also efforts on the part of the United States and its European, you can call them vassals, partners, what have you, all making very concerted moves, especially in the realm of information, to change the narrative of this conflict. So lately it's been stalemate. There's been a intelligence assessment that we don't really know where it came from. We don't know who did the assessment. We don't really know what it says, but supposedly it's the big information dump was that 87% of Russia's troops have been killed in the conflict in Ukraine. And this is despite the fact that Putin during this presser said there's about 1,500 people per day joining Russian forces in order to go to Ukraine and fight if they're needed. And so given there's such a discrepancy, and given the fact that Ukraine is having its own manpower issues, Carl, you mentioned the weapons issues. I mean, who are we supposed to believe here? I'll kick it back to you, Ben, because a lot of people would say, oh, well, Putin is obviously just lying. We're in the West, and whatever Vladimir Putin says is just propaganda from the Kremlin.
This has been predictable for well over a year. I mean, I remember late last year, late 2022, I did a series of reports looking at some comments from Western officials, not high-level officials, but lower-level officials who said that the conflict was frozen. And it's been frozen for a year now. And now there is discussion, there was all this propaganda for many months about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which was a complete failure. And it was obvious that it would not go anywhere. And now the discussion is the exact opposite. That's why Western capitals that had been opposed to a peace treaty are allegedly, again, I'm a little skeptical of these reports, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were true, that in the background, there are some secret negotiations going on, because these Western capitals can recognize that Ukraine is utterly defeated. And the longer they wait, there is a very real possibility that Ukraine, as it exists territorially, will continue to be, just essentially turned into a rump state. So I think, we can speculate a lot, but I think what's really interesting about Putin's speech is Reuters, the UK-based international newswire, very mainstream media, they published a summary of his speech, and actually I think they included a very interesting quote from Putin. I don't know if I can share my screen. I don't know if that, can I try that? Let's see if this works here.
Yeah,
sure. But this is from Reuters, from this Putin press conference. And I think, these are, I tried sharing it. I don't know if you can do, yeah.
Yes,
these are the quotes that, these are the quotes that will be mentioned in news and, newswires like Reuters. But unless you're looking for the news, you're not going to find quotes like this, because they'll never be mentioned on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or the New York Times. But this is a very important quote, because in this press conference, Putin was asked about relations with the West. And this is what I talked about earlier. He said, NATO expansion into Ukraine is responsible for this tragedy. He refers to it as a tragedy multiple times. He says they forced us into these actions. What the United States conceived and organized, Europe stands and silently watches, or plays and sing along with them. So he's saying very clear, the US is in charge. Europe is going along with this. How can we build relations with them? And here's the really important quote that, again, you're not going to see highlighted. I mean, if you go, this is a very long article in Reuters that summarized the press conference, but I'm just going to read this quote. When internal changes happen in the United States, when they start respecting other people, other countries, when they start looking for compromise instead of trying to resolve their issues with sanctions and military intervention, then the fundamental conditions will be in place to restore fully fledged relations. So far, such conditions are not in place, but we are ready for that. As for the rules-based order, there are in fact no such rules. They change every day in line with politics and the short-term interests of those who talk about such an order. Again, these are words from Putin that you're never allowed to, again, CNN will not highlight that quote, but that's an extremely reasonable observation that is shared by many countries around the world. You keep asking us why we don't improve our relations with the West. The West is the one that is waging war on us, that is trying to prevent us from having positive relations when they change their policies of domination and sanctions and war, in which they believe that they should control the entire world and no other country has the possibility of pursuing an alternative path of economic development, alternative political models. It's impossible within those conditions to have positive relations with them. And you keep blaming us, but you never talk about what they have done. And that's why it's not because, you know, a lot of people, you know, in the global South, Russia is very popular. And it's not because a lot of people in the global South see the Russian government model or economic model as something they want to emulate. It's not because of that. It's because Russia is one of the few countries whose diplomats and leaders will go on the international stage and make comments like that, even though everyone in the global South agrees. But many of them are afraid of making comments like that because they know that they would face retaliation by the Western powers, including sanctions, color revolutions, regime change operations. This is a perspective that is shared by the global majority. And yet the entire Western media frames it all around democracy and Ukraine and all this. But of course, Ukraine is symptomatic of something that's much bigger, which is imperialism.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Carl, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, looks like they're all ready to throw Ukraine under the bus. I mean, can I share my screen? Let me see.
I should be
so right now, you know, we have we have the Washington Post polling up. Am I sharing? Can you see? Yeah, we have
I
the
control the sharing, but
okay,
yeah, but I can do it.
Make the magic. So Washington Post had that article basically blaming a ragtag group of Ukrainian team for sabotaging Nord Stream. I mean, I don't. They really think their readership are stupid. You know, Baltic Sea is one of the most surveyed, monitored area by the NATO, and they're gonna tell us that this ragtag group of Ukrainians somehow carry out the sophisticated attack on Germany's vital infrastructure. I mean, this is bogus. But this is what's going to happen: is Ukraine, ultimately, Zelensky will probably be their scapegoat. You know, all the blame is going to be placed on Ukrainians for having sacrificed half their male population in this very deadly proxy war against Russia. And this will hopefully serve a good lesson to any other U.S. vassals who are thinking about volunteering for another deadly war, a proxy war for the interests of the United States. I mean, just look at Ukraine. What happened to Ukraine? They get kicked to the curb in less than 2 years. You know, this is a lesson for governments in Taiwan and governments in the Philippines. You know, why would you want to end up like Ukraine? I mean, there's no upside. There's literally no upside in this.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.